Darnell had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. Not because it was fancy or extravagant, though the restaurant they were headed to certainly wasn't cheap, but because it was meaningful. His oldest, Maya, had just been accepted into a summer arts program that only took a handful of kids from the whole city. She'd spent months preparing her portfolio, sketching late into the night at the kitchen table while he sipped tea and pretended to read, really just watching her with quiet pride. When the acceptance letter came, she didn't scream or jump around. She just looked up, eyes wide, and whispered, "Dad." They said yes. That was enough. That was everything, so he'd planned this dinner carefully. Not too formal. Maya hated feeling stiff, but nice enough that she'd feel celebrated. He called ahead, made a reservation under his name, even double-checked the dress code. He wanted it to feel special without making it a big production. Just a family moment, the four of them marking something real. That afternoon, he pressed his best slacks, the ones with the subtle pinstripe he only wore for job interviews or weddings. Lena ironed her blouse while humming an old Stevie Wonder tune, the one about higher ground. Isaiah, the youngest, kept asking if he could wear his new shoes, the ones with the glow-in-the-dark soles, even though they were more for playgrounds than restaurants. Darnell finally said yes, but only if he promised not to run. "It's a celebration," Lena reminded him gently, "not a race." They left the house just after 6, the sky still holding on to daylight like it didn't want to let go. The drive was smooth, windows down, warm air rushing in with the scent of blooming jasmine from someone's yard. Maya sat in the back, flipping through a sketchbook, occasionally pointing out shapes in the clouds. "That one looks like a dragon eating a taco," Isaiah announced. Everyone laughed. Even Darnell, who usually saved his laughter for punchlines with more setup, chuckled. It felt good. Light. Like they were stepping into something warm and safe. Marlowe's wasn't the kind of place they went often. It sat on a quiet corner downtown, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, with dark wood panels and soft lighting that made everything look like it belonged in a movie. Darnell had read online that the chef used locally sourced ingredients and that the wine list was thoughtfully curated. He didn't care much about wine, but he liked that the place seemed to care about details. That mattered. When they pulled up, a valet offered to park the car, but Darnell declined with a polite nod. He preferred to keep the keys. Old habit. They walked in together, the kids slightly ahead, eyes wide at the low hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. The hostess greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Reservation?" she asked, already tapping on her tablet. Darnell gave his name. She scanned the screen, paused, then led them through the dining room without another word. The booth they were shown to was in the back corner, near the restrooms and a service door. Not exactly the prime real estate by the windows or the fireplace, but Darnell didn't say anything. Maybe it was just what was available. Still, he noticed how the hostess didn't offer menus or ask if they'd like drinks while they settled. She just placed 4 laminated cards on the table and walked away. Lena smoothed the tablecloth and gave him a look, half question, half reassurance. He squeezed her hand under the table. "It's fine," he murmured. "We're here for Maya." Maya was already studying the menu like it was a puzzle to solve. "Do you think they have vegan options?" she asked. Not because she was vegan, but because her best friend was, and she liked imagining meals they could share. Isaiah, meanwhile, was tracing the grain of the wood with his finger, whispering numbers under his breath, a habit he'd picked up when he was nervous. A few minutes passed. Then more. Other tables were being served water, bread, even cocktails. Their table remained untouched. Darnell glanced toward the bar, where servers moved with practiced ease, balancing trays and laughing with guests. No one came their way. Then finally a young man approached. He wore a crisp white shirt, black apron, and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He didn't greet them, didn't smile, just stood at the edge of the table and began reciting the evening's specials in a flat, rushed tone, as if reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't believe in. When he finished, there was a beat of silence. Lena asked about the salmon. Was it wild caught? He nodded once, eyes already scanning the room behind them. Darnell asked if they could see the wine list. The waiter handed it over without a word, then turned slightly as if bracing himself against having to stay any longer. But then something shifted. The waiter's gaze flickered to Darnell, really looked at him for the first time. And in that look was something cold, something edged with judgment. It was subtle, but Darnell felt it like a draft in a sealed room. He'd seen that look before, not always so open, but often enough to recognize it. The kind that sized you up and decided you didn't belong before you'd even spoken. He didn't react. Didn't sigh or frown. He just handed the wine list back and said, "We'll need a few more minutes." The waiter gave a curt nod and walked off, not toward the kitchen, but toward a group of well-dressed guests near the front who'd just arrived and were being treated like royalty. Lena leaned in. "You okay?" "Yeah," Darnell said, "just let's enjoy tonight." For Maya looked up from her menu. "I'm getting the mushroom risotto," she declared as if sealing a promise. Isaiah grinned. "I'm getting the biggest burger they have," Darnell smiled. That was his cue. This was their night. Nothing, not a cold shoulder, not a dismissive glance was going to steal that from them. He reached for the water pitcher on the table, but before he could pour, the waiter reappeared, holding a fresh carafe. "Let me," the waiter said, voice tight. He stepped close, too close, and leaned over the table. Darnell shifted slightly to give him room. That's when it happened. The pitcher tilted, not by accident, not by slip, but with a deliberate flick of the wrist, and a full glass of ice water poured straight into Darnell's lap. The cold shock hit first, then the wet weight of soaked fabric. Ice cubes clattered onto the floor. Maya gasped. Isaiah froze mid-reach for a breadstick. The waiter straightened up slowly. He didn't reach for napkins, didn't apologize, just looked down at Darnell, one corner of his mouth twitching upward, and said, "Guess you should have been paying attention." The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Around them, conversations dipped. A fork clinked against a plate. Someone cleared their throat. Darnell stayed seated. Water dripped from his slacks onto the floor. His hands rested on the table, steady. He looked up at the waiter. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "You did that on purpose," he said, voice low but clear. The waiter's smirk faltered for just a second. Then he turned and walked away as if nothing had happened. But something had. And in that moment, everything changed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick like the air before a storm breaks. Darnell didn't move right away. He just sat there, water soaking through his slacks, cold against his skin, his hands resting flat on the tablecloth. His daughter Maya stared at him with wide eyes, her sketchbook forgotten in her lap. Her little brother Isaiah had gone completely still, his usual chatter replaced by a stunned quiet that felt louder than any outburst. Lena reached across the table without a word and placed her hand over Darnell's. Her fingers were warm, steady. She didn't say "it's okay" or "let it go" because it wasn't okay and they both knew it. Instead, she just held on like an anchor. Around them, the restaurant kept humming, but slower now, quieter. A woman at the next table stopped mid-sentence and glanced over. A man near the bar turned slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable but alert. Even the clinking of silverware seemed to pause, as if the whole room was holding its breath. Darnell finally stood. Not fast, not angry, just deliberate. Water dripped from his pants onto the tile floor with a soft plink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point or glare. He just looked toward where the waiter had disappeared behind the service counter and said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "That wasn't an accident." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. A few heads turned fully now. Someone murmured something to their companion. The waiter, who had been pretending to refill a tray of glasses, stiffened. He turned slowly, arms crossed as if bracing for a confrontation he thought he could win. "You got a problem?" he asked, voice edged with false confidence. Darnell took a step forward, but Lena stood too, gently pulling him back by the elbow. "We didn't come here for this," she said, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't talking to the waiter. She was reminding Darnell and herself of why they were there in the first place. But then Isaiah spoke. He was still sitting, small in the booth, clutching a breadstick like it was a lifeline. "Why'd you pour water on Dad?" he asked, voice clear and confused, the kind of honest question only a child would ask without fear. The waiter scoffed. Maybe if he hadn't been sitting like he owned the place, he didn't finish. Because that's when a new voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" A woman in a dark blazer stepped into view. She wasn't much older than the waiter, but carried herself like someone who'd earned every inch of authority she held. Her name tag read Evelyn, and her eyes moved quickly, taking in Darnell's soaked clothes, Maya's tense shoulders, Isaiah's furrowed brow, Lena's protective stance, and the waiter's defensive posture. Before anyone could answer, a young busser appeared beside her, whispering urgently in her ear. Evelyn listened, her expression tightening with each word. She didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss. She just absorbed it all like she'd seen this kind of thing before, but refused to let it slide. When the busser finished, Evelyn turned to the waiter. "Go to the office, now." The waiter blinked. "What?" "I didn't do anything." "You know exactly what you did," Evelyn said, her voice low but sharp as glass. "And you're done for the night." He opened his mouth to argue, but one look from Evelyn shut him up. He shot a glare toward Darnell's table, less anger now, more panic, and stalked off toward the back. Evelyn didn't watch him go. Instead, she turned to the family, her posture softening. She knelt slightly so she wasn't towering over the kids. "I am so sorry," she said, and it didn't sound rehearsed or corporate. It sounded human, real. "That should never have happened in my restaurant." Maya finally spoke, her voice small. "He did it on purpose." "I know," Evelyn said simply, "and it stops now." She signaled to another server who rushed over with a stack of clean towels. Evelyn helped Darnell blot his clothes, not making a show of it, just offering quiet assistance. Then she turned to the kids. "How about we move you to a better table? One with a view and better service." Isaiah perked up. "Do you have one near the fireplace?" Evelyn smiled for the first time. "Actually, yes. Right by the window." As they gathered their things, Lena whispered to Darnell, "We don't have to stay." He looked at Maya, who was watching him with that same quiet intensity she'd had when she showed him her acceptance letter. He looked at Isaiah, already bouncing slightly on his toes at the idea of a new table, and he thought about the drive over, the laughter, the jasmine-scented air, the feeling that tonight was supposed to be theirs. "We stay," he said. They followed Evelyn to a table near the front, bathed in warm light from the hanging lamps and the glow of the street outside. A new server, older with kind eyes and a name tag that read Rosa, greeted them with genuine warmth. She brought fresh water, warm bread, and without being asked, a dry napkin for Darnell's lap. As they settled in, the tension began to ease. Maya opened her sketchbook again. Isaiah asked if the burger came with fries shaped like stars. It didn't, but Rosa promised to ask the kitchen to make it special. Lena finally exhaled, her shoulders dropping like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Darnell watched his family slowly return to themselves. And he realized something. The waiter hadn't just spilled water. He'd tried to shrink them, to make them feel small, out of place, unwelcome. But in that moment, sitting at a new table with his people around him, Darnell felt anything but small. He caught Evelyn's eye across the room. She gave a small nod, not of pity but of respect. He nodded back. Dinner hadn't gone as planned. But maybe, just maybe, it was becoming something even more important. A reminder that dignity isn't given by others. It's carried within. And no careless act, no smirk, no icy splash of water could wash that away. As Rosa returned with their orders, steaming plates, careful hands, a real smile, Darnell reached for Maya's hand under the table. She squeezed back. Isaiah grinned around a mouthful of fries. Lena leaned into his shoulder just for a second. Outside, the city hummed on. But inside, at that table by the window, something had been restored. Not just a meal, not just a celebration, but a sense of belonging, earned, not granted, and fiercely protected. The meal continued, but nothing felt quite the same. Not in a bad way, but in the way that happens when something real cuts through the surface of an ordinary evening. The food was good, maybe even great, but no one was really eating to taste the chef's technique. They were eating to reclaim the night, bite by bite. Darnell watched Maya push her risotto around her plate, not because she didn't like it, but because her mind was somewhere else, probably sketching the scene in her head, turning hurt into something she could hold and understand. Isaiah, on the other hand, had fully committed to his burger. Ketchup smudged at the corner of his mouth, legs swinging under the table like nothing had happened. Kids had a way of bouncing back faster, or maybe they just hadn't learned yet how to carry the weight adults hoisted onto their shoulders without asking. Lena reached for her wine glass and took a slow sip, her eyes scanning the room, not with suspicion but with quiet awareness. She'd lived long enough to know that moments like this didn't just disappear when the offender walked away. They lingered in the air, in the way strangers glanced over, in the way your own body remembered the chill of humiliation long after your clothes dried. But she also knew that staying, finishing the meal, laughing at Isaiah's joke about fries shaped like dinosaurs, was its own kind of resistance. It said, "We belong here, and we won't be chased out." Darnell leaned back in his chair, the damp spot on his slacks now just a cool patch against his skin. He wasn't angry anymore, not in the hot, burning way that made you want to yell. This was quieter, deeper. It was the kind of anger that settled into your bones and asked, "How many times has this happened to someone else?" He thought about the busser who'd whispered to Evelyn. Probably young, probably seen this before, probably chose to speak up anyway. That small act of courage mattered more than people realized. As they neared the end of dinner, Evelyn returned. She didn't hover or over-apologize. She simply stood by the table, hands clasped in front of her, and said, "I've spoken with the team. What happened earlier won't be tolerated. Not tonight, not ever. And I want you to know your meal is on the house. No discussion." Darnell started to protest, but she held up a gentle hand. "Please, let me do this. Not as damage control, but as a statement." There was something in her voice that made him stop. It wasn't guilt. It was conviction. Lena spoke up. "Thank you. That means a lot." Evelyn nodded, then crouched slightly to be at eye level with Maya and Isaiah. "You two handled that like pros," she said with a soft smile. "Especially you," she added to Isaiah. "Asking why someone would do that? That's the question everyone should be asking." Isaiah beamed like he'd just won a medal. After she left, the family sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the street outside. Couples strolled past under the amber glow of lamplights. A saxophone drifted from a nearby club, smooth and low. The world kept turning, but inside Marlowe's something had shifted. Later, as they waited for the check, though they knew it wouldn't come, Maya finally closed her sketchbook and looked at her dad. "Do you think he's been fired?" Darnell hesitated. "I don't know, but I hope he's been held accountable." "Accountable?" Isaiah asked, mouth full of chocolate cake Rosa had brought out just because. "It means he has to face what he did," Lena explained gently. "Not just say sorry, but really understand why it was wrong." Maya frowned. "But what if he doesn't care?" "That's not your job to fix," Darnell said. "Your job is to keep being you, kind, talented, and unafraid to take up space." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away for later. When they finally stood to leave, Rosa walked them to the door with 2 to-go boxes, leftover bread and a slice of cake for the road. "Come back any time," she said, and it didn't sound like a line. It sounded like an invitation. Outside, the night air was cooler, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint scent of rain. Darnell unlocked the car and the kids climbed in without complaint, already buzzing about the evening in their own ways. Maya listing details for a new drawing. Isaiah reenacting the heroic moment he spoke up. As Darnell started the engine, Lena reached over and squeezed his knee. "You okay?" He thought about it. Not just the water, not just the smirk, but the way his children had watched him, waiting to see how he'd respond. How he'd chosen calm over rage, presence over retreat. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." But the story didn't end there. The next morning, while Isaiah built a fort out of couch cushions and Maya sketched at the kitchen table, Darnell checked his email. He hadn't expected anything, but there it was, a message from Evelyn. Subject line, "Thank you." He opened it. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. She wrote that after reviewing security footage, which clearly showed the deliberate spill, the waiter had been let go that morning. Not suspended, not warned, terminated. She also mentioned that she'd called a staff meeting that afternoon to talk about respect, bias, and what it truly meant to serve guests, not just take orders. She ended by saying, "Your family's grace under pressure reminded us all what this business is really about. People." Darnell read it twice. Then he showed it to Lena. She read it silently, then looked up with tears in her eyes, not sad ones, but the kind that come when something broken gets a little mended. Later that week, Maya's art teacher asked her to share what inspired her latest piece. Maya hesitated, then described the restaurant, the water, the silence, and the moment her dad stood up, not with fists, but with truth. She didn't name names. She just said, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay seated and still be yourself." The class was quiet afterward. Then one student raised their hand and said, "I've had that happen too." And just like that, a single moment became a ripple. Darnell didn't post about it online. He didn't call news stations or demand headlines. But he did tell the story quietly, carefully, to a neighbor, to a coworker, to the parents at Maya's program orientation. Not for sympathy, but so others would know. Dignity doesn't need a spotlight to exist. It just needs to be witnessed, and sometimes, when it is, it changes more than one life. Weeks later, as summer settled in and Maya packed her bag for the first day of her arts program, she tucked a small drawing into her sketchbook, a man sitting at a table, water pooling at his feet but his head held high. Above him, in delicate pencil strokes, she'd written, "He stayed." Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the spill, not the smirk, not even the firing, but the choice to remain, fully human, fully present in a world that sometimes tries to tell you otherwise. The days after the dinner passed quietly, like ripples smoothing out on a pond. Life didn't stop. School ended, summer routines began, laundry piled up, and grocery lists grew longer. But something had shifted beneath the surface, not just for Darnell's family, but for others who'd been near that moment, even peripherally. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but shows up in small choices. A server pausing to really listen, a parent asking their child what fair really means, a manager deciding that silence in the face of disrespect is its own kind of harm. Darnell went back to work, same as always. He fixed engines during the day, came home smelling of oil and metal, kissed his kids on the forehead and asked about their days. But now, when co-workers made offhand comments that used to slide past him, he found himself speaking up, not loudly, not combatively, but clearly. "I don't see it that way," he'd say, or, "That's not how it feels from where I stand." And more often than not, the room would go quiet for a beat. Then someone else would nod and say, "Yeah, actually, you're right." At home, Maya started a new sketch series she called Moments That Stick. One drawing showed a hand reaching across a table. Another showed two kids whispering in a hallway, one comforting the other. She didn't explain them unless asked. But when her little brother saw the one of their dad at the restaurant, water on his lap, back straight, eyes steady, he didn't say much. He just tacked it to his bedroom wall right above his bed. Lena noticed changes too. She'd always been the kind of person who smoothed things over, who chose peace over confrontation. But now she found herself less willing to accept "that's just how it is" as an answer. When a neighbor made a joke that landed wrong at a block party, Lena didn't laugh it off. She simply said, "I don't think that's funny," and walked away. No drama, no lecture, just a quiet refusal to pretend. Then one afternoon, about 3 weeks after the dinner, Darnell got a call. It was Evelyn. Not an email this time, but a real voice on the other end of the line. She sounded tired but determined. "I hope I'm not overstepping," she began, "but I've been thinking a lot about what happened that night, and I'd like to ask you something." Darnell sat down at the kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear. "Go ahead." She explained that Marlowe's was rolling out a new training program for all staff, front of house, kitchen, even management. It wasn't just about wine pairings or plating techniques. It was about respect, about recognizing unconscious bias, about understanding that service isn't just about food, it's about humanity. And she wanted Darnell to be part of it. Not as a victim, she was quick to add, but as someone who showed us what real dignity looks like under pressure. "I'd like you to speak to our new hires. Just 10 minutes. Share your perspective. What it felt like. What mattered. What didn't." Darnell was quiet for a long moment. He hadn't expected this. He'd assumed the story was over. The waiter gone, the apology made, the family moving on. But Evelyn wasn't treating it like a closed case. She was treating it like a lesson. "Why me?" he finally asked. "Because you stayed," she said simply. "You didn't yell. You didn't leave. You held your ground without losing your grace. And that's something our team needs to see, not as a performance but as a possibility." He thought about Maya's drawing, about Isaiah's question, About the way Lena had looked at him that night, not with fear, but with pride. "I'll do it," he said, the day of the talk. He wore the same slacks he'd worn that night, clean now, pressed, no trace of water left. Not as a reminder of the hurt, but as a symbol that you can go back to the place where something broke and help put it back together. The training room was small, with folding chairs and a whiteboard. About 15 new employees sat in a loose semicircle, some young, some older, a mix of backgrounds, all watching him with cautious curiosity. Evelyn introduced him briefly, then stepped back, giving him the floor. Darnell didn't start with anger. He started with his daughter. "I took my family out to celebrate," he said, voice calm. "My oldest had just gotten into a program she worked really hard for. We were happy, just happy." He described the drive over, the glow-in-the-dark shoes, the way his son saw dragons in the clouds. He painted the evening not as a setup for conflict, but as a normal, loving family moment. Because that's what it was supposed to be. Then he talked about the waiter. Not to shame him, but to name what happened. He didn't trip. He didn't fumble. He chose to pour that water. And then he chose to smirk. That's the part people sometimes miss. It wasn't just the act. It was the message behind it. "You don't belong here." He paused, looked around the room. "But here's what I want you to know," he continued. "Belonging isn't something someone gives you. It's something you carry. And no one, no server, no stranger, no system can take that away unless you let them." A young woman in the front row wiped her eyes quickly. A man near the back nodded slowly. "I stayed," Darnell said, "not because I wanted to prove a point, but because my kids were watching, and I wanted them to see that you can face disrespect without becoming disrespectful, that you can demand fairness without losing your kindness." He didn't give a speech. He told a story. And stories, when told honestly, have a way of sticking. Afterward, people came up to thank him. One server, barely out of high school, said, "I've seen stuff like that happen before, and I never knew what to do." Darnell put a hand on his shoulder. "Now you do." Evelyn waited until the room cleared. "Thank you," she said, voice thick. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Darnell replied. But it felt like the right thing. As he walked out of the restaurant that afternoon, sunlight warm on his face, he thought about how healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet conversation in a training room. Sometimes it's a manager choosing to act instead of ignore. Sometimes it's a father showing his kids that standing tall doesn't require shouting. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove home, not as a man who'd been wronged, but as someone who'd helped turn a moment of pain into something that could protect others. And that, he realized, was its own kind of celebration. Summer deepened, stretching long and golden over the city. The incident at the restaurant didn't vanish from memory, but it settled into the family's story like a chapter that had been read, understood, and tucked carefully into the larger book of their lives. It wasn't the whole story, just a moment that revealed something true about who they were and who they wanted to be. Maya's arts program began in earnest, and she thrived. She painted less about dragons and tacos now and more about people, faces, in the subway, hands holding grocery bags, a woman laughing with her head thrown back. Her teacher noticed the shift. "Your work feels more present," she said one afternoon. Maya just smiled. She didn't mention the restaurant, but she didn't have to. The awareness was in every brushstroke. At home, Isaiah started asking questions that surprised everyone. Not just "why is the sky blue, but why do some people act mean when they're scared, or if someone says you don't belong, does that make it true?" Lena and Darnell answered as best they could, not with perfect wisdom, but with honesty. They told him that fear often hides behind cruelty, and that belonging isn't granted by others. It's claimed by how you carry yourself. He listened carefully, then went back to building his Lego spaceship, as if storing the answers for later use. One evening, while washing dishes, Lena mentioned that a friend from her book club had heard about what happened. Not from social media, not from news reports, but through word of mouth. She said her cousin works at a restaurant downtown, and they've been talking about it in staff meetings, Lena said, drying a plate. Not to gossip, but to ask, what would we do? Darnell nodded. That was the thing about moments like theirs. They didn't need to go viral to matter. They just needed to echo in the right ears. A few weeks later, a local community newsletter reached out. Not a big publication, just a monthly email sent to neighbors, teachers, small business owners, the kind of place where real life gets shared, not performed. They'd heard about the dinner through a mutual friend of Evelyn's and asked if Darnell would be willing to write a short reflection. Not to shame the restaurant, not to demand justice, but to share what it meant to be seen, and then to be believed. He thought about it for days. He wasn't a writer, but he remembered how Maya had said, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay seated and still be yourself." Maybe writing this was another way of staying seated, of refusing to let the moment disappear. So he wrote, just a few paragraphs. He talked about the drive over, the glow-in-the-dark shoes, the quiet pride in his daughter's eyes. He described the spill not as a dramatic act, but as a small cruelty wrapped in a smirk. And he wrote about Evelyn, not as a hero, but as someone who chose to act when it would have been easier to look away. He ended with this. What stayed with me wasn't the water. It was the silence that followed, and then the voice that broke it. Because in that moment I realized my family wasn't alone, and that changes everything. The newsletter published it the next month. No fanfare, no comments section, just words on a screen, read by people who cared about their community. A teacher emailed to say she'd shared it with her students during a lesson on empathy. A restaurant owner wrote to ask if he'd be open to speaking with his staff. Darnell said yes to both. Meanwhile, life kept moving. Maya's program ended with a small gallery showing. Her final piece was titled, "Still Here." It showed a man at a table, water pooling at his feet, but his posture calm, his children beside him, their faces turned toward him like he was their compass. People stood in front of it longer than they did the other pieces. No one said much, they didn't need to. Isaiah started a kindness list in his notebook, things he saw people do that made the world softer. Holding a door, sharing a snack, saying, "I see you." He added one entry that made Lena cry. Dad stayed when it got hard. As summer turned toward fall, Darnell got another call from Evelyn. She sounded different, lighter maybe. She told him that turnover in the front of house staff had dropped, that new hires were asking more questions during training. That one, server had even started a monthly listening circle, where staff could talk about tough customer interactions without judgment. "And you know what?" she said. "People keep asking about you. Not in a gossipy way, more like, what would he do?" Darnell chuckled. "I'm just a regular guy." "But you showed us what regular can look like when it's rooted in dignity," she replied. "That's not small." He didn't know it then, but that call would lead to something unexpected. A few months later, a nonprofit that worked with youth and workplace equity invited him to join a panel on everyday courage. He almost said no. He wasn't an activist, not in the traditional sense. But then he thought about Isaiah's notebook, Maya's painting, Lena's quiet strength. This wasn't about him. It was about showing others that standing up doesn't always mean standing out. Sometimes it just means staying put and staying true. The panel went well. He spoke plainly, without jargon or grand statements. Afterward, a teenager approached him, eyes red from crying. "My dad got treated like that last week," he whispered. "He didn't say anything. He just left. I thought he was weak. But after hearing you, I get it now. He was protecting us." Darnell put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your dad sounds like a good man." He walked away that night not feeling like a speaker, but like a witness, someone who'd seen something real and chose to carry it forward gently, without fanfare. Years later, when Maya applied to art school, she included "Still Here" in her portfolio. In her artist statement, she wrote, "This piece is about the quiet moments that shape us, the ones no one films, but everyone feels. It's about my father, yes, but also about every person who's ever been told they don't belong, and stayed anyway." The restaurant Marlowe's is still there. The menu's changed, the decor's been updated, but the table by the window remains. Sometimes, if you sit there at just the right hour, you'll see a family laughing over shared fries, a couple, holding hands, a father listening intently as his child tells a story only they understand. And if you look closely, you might notice that the servers move with a little more care, listen with a little more presence, and treat every guest, not as a transaction, but as a person. Because sometimes, one moment of courage doesn't just change a night. It changes a place, a practice, a pattern. And in a world that often rewards noise, the quiet choice to stay and to be seen can echo longer than anyone expects.